On June 8, 1972, a South Vietnamese Air Force A-1 Skyraider dropped a napalm canister on the village of Trang Bang. The pilot believed he was hitting a Viet Cong position. He was wrong. The napalm landed on a group of civilians, including children, who were fleeing down Route 1. A 9-year-old girl named Phan Thi Kim Phuc tore off her burning clothes and ran screaming toward the camera of AP photographer Nick Ut. Ut photographed her, then put down his camera and drove her to a hospital. The photograph won the Pulitzer Prize. It appeared on the front page of newspapers around the world. It became the single most recognizable image of the Vietnam War, and it told with devastating precision exactly one thing about napalm. Everything else, the scale, the policy, the deliberate choices made in Washington and Saigon about where and how much to burn, stayed buried in classified targeting reports and Defense Department procurement records for decades. The photograph showed you what napalm did to one child. It did not show you what 388,000 tons of it did to an entire country. Napalm was not invented for Vietnam. It was invented in 1942 by a team of Harvard chemists led by Louis Fieser, developed specifically to burn Japanese cities. The name is a contraction of naphthenic acid and palmitic acid, the chemical components that, when mixed with gasoline, produce a substance that ignites at approximately 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, sticks to everything it touches, and cannot be extinguished with water. In World War II, napalm was used in firebombing raids that killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Korea, it was used extensively against enemy troop concentrations and supply lines. By the time American aircraft began dropping it on Vietnam in the early 1960s, napalm had been refined, tested, and optimized through 2 previous wars. The weapon that burned Kim Phuc was not an improvisation. It was a mature technology with a carefully documented history of what it did to human bodies. The Dow Chemical Company became the primary manufacturer of Napalm B, the improved formulation used in Vietnam, in 1965. Napalm B replaced the original napalm with a mixture based on polystyrene, benzene, and gasoline that burned longer, stuck more tenaciously, and was more resistant to accidental ignition during handling. Dow's contract with the Defense Department to produce Napalm B was worth approximately $5 million per year at its peak. The company's decision to accept and maintain that contract, despite internal dissent from employees and external pressure from anti-war protesters, became one of the defining corporate controversies of the Vietnam era. Dow recruiters were driven off college campuses. The company's annual reports were disrupted at shareholder meetings. Dow maintained the contract until 1969, when it declined to renew, not because of the protests, but because a competitor offered the Defense Department a lower price. The delivery system for napalm in Vietnam was primarily the BLU-27 firebomb, a finned canister roughly the size and shape of a bathtub that held approximately 75 gallons of napalm B. When released from an aircraft and detonated on impact, the BLU-27 produced a fireball approximately 270 feet long and 75 feet wide. The ignited napalm scattered in burning droplets that could travel up to 150 feet from the point of impact, each droplet burning at temperatures that melted steel and incinerated organic matter in seconds. A single strike by 2 aircraft carrying standard napalm loads could produce a fire zone covering approximately 3 acres. At the peak of the air war in 1967 and 1968, American aircraft were dropping napalm on targets in South Vietnam, North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia on a daily basis. The targeting policy for napalm strikes evolved throughout the war in ways that the Defense Department's public statements consistently misrepresented. Officially, napalm was used against military targets, enemy troop concentrations, supply caches, fortified positions, tunnel complexes. The actual targeting record, reconstructed from declassified strike reports and congressional investigations conducted after the war, shows a more complicated picture. In free fire zones, areas designated by American and South Vietnamese authorities as cleared of civilian population where anything moving could be engaged, napalm was used against any target of opportunity. The designation of an area as a free fire zone did not require verification that civilians had actually left. It required paperwork. The human cost of this targeting policy fell disproportionately on the rural South Vietnamese civilian population that the United States was ostensibly in Vietnam to protect. The precise number of Vietnamese civilians killed by napalm is impossible to establish because the Defense Department did not track civilian casualties from airstrikes with any systematic rigor, and because the Vietnamese records from the war period are incomplete. The most careful estimates produced by researchers working from hospital records, refugee testimony, and strike documentation suggest that civilian casualties from air-delivered incendiary weapons in South Vietnam alone numbered in the tens of thousands. The International Red Cross documented napalm burn cases in South Vietnamese hospitals throughout the war. The burns it treated were distinctive and unmistakable. Napalm burns do not look like other burns. They go deeper. They heal more slowly. They leave a specific pattern of tissue destruction that physicians who treated them in Vietnam described in terms that do not belong in polite company. Dr. Martin Russ, an American physician who worked in a civilian hospital in the Mekong Delta in 1967, wrote in a medical journal report that he treated napalm burn victims weekly throughout his tour. He described children brought in by their parents with burns covering 40 and 60% of their body surface, burns that had been caused not by enemy action, but by airstrikes on their own villages. He described the treatment options available to him, which were inadequate, and the outcomes, which were frequently fatal, and the parents who sat beside the beds of children who were going to die and who did not understand why the Americans who were supposed to be helping them had burned their children. Russ's report was published in a medical journal with a limited readership and generated no public response. The legal status of napalm under international humanitarian law was contested throughout the Vietnam War and remains contested today. The United States government's position, maintained consistently from the 1960s through the present, is that napalm used against legitimate military targets is lawful under international law. The opposing position, advanced by the International Committee of the Red Cross, by legal scholars, and eventually by a majority of United Nations member states, is that incendiary weapons used in or near civilian areas are inherently indiscriminate and therefore prohibited. In 1980, Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons restricted the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. The United States signed the convention, but did not ratify Protocol 3 until 2009, 37 years after the last napalm strike in Vietnam. The domestic opposition to napalm use in Vietnam was intense, sustained, and ultimately more successful at changing corporate behavior than government policy. Campus protests targeting Dow chemical recruiters began in 1966 and escalated through 1967 and 1968. The protests at the University of Wisconsin in October 1967, where police used tear gas and clubs against students blocking a Dow recruiting session, injured dozens of students and produced images that circulated nationally alongside the images from Vietnam. The connection between the weapon and the corporation that made it gave the anti-war movement a specific, nameable target for its anger. You could not picket the Defense Department's napalm policy. You could stand outside a Dow chemical recruitment table and refuse to let it proceed. The self-immolation of Quaker activist Norman Morrison outside the Pentagon on November 2, 1965, was an explicit response to napalm use in Vietnam. Morrison, 31 years old, burned himself to death 40 feet below the office window of Robert McNamara. He was carrying his infant daughter, who he placed on the ground before setting himself alight. He was protesting a news report about napalm deaths in a Vietnamese village. McNamara later wrote that Morrison's death had a profound effect on him, that he had seen Morrison burning from his window and had been shaken by it. The napalm contracts were not cancelled. The air war was not modified. McNamara's feelings about what he had seen from his window produced no change in the policy that had produced them. The photograph of Kim Phuc by Nick Ut was taken on the last day. Napalm was used in a major strike in Vietnam by South Vietnamese Air Force aircraft. The irony of this timing, that the image which defined napalm's horror in the public consciousness was taken on the day that type of strike effectively ended, has rarely been noted. Kim Phuc survived. She underwent 17 surgeries over the following years. She eventually came to Canada as a student and sought asylum. She has spent her adult life as a peace activist and UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, using the experience documented in Ut's photograph as a foundation for advocacy, rather than as a wound she has been unable to close. She has met Nick Ut multiple times. She has described her relationship with the image of herself as complicated, as something she has had to make peace with, rather than something that came naturally. The 388,000 tons of napalm dropped on Vietnam did not win the war. The villages it burned were rebuilt. The forests it destroyed have partially regrown. The people it killed are counted among the war's uncounted. Kim Phuc is 61 years old. The scars from her burns cover portions of her back, neck, and left arm. She says she is no longer in pain. She says she has forgiven the pilot who dropped the canister. She says she does not know if he has forgiven himself or if he has even thought about it. The pilot's name has never been definitively established in the public record. He flew the mission. He dropped the canister. He flew back to base. What happened to him after that is not part of the story that anyone recorded. That gap between the person who delivers the weapon and the person who receives it, between the policy that authorizes it and the child running down the road, is what 388,000 tons of napalm looks like when you reduce it to its human dimension. One photograph, one child, one road. Everything else requires you to do the arithmetic yourself. There is a video on screen right now about the other weapons the Vietnam War burned into history and the people who survived them. Subscribe. The stories that get reduced to a single image usually contain multitudes.